Hi there, my name is Griffin Walker. I'm an educator and web developer from Portland, Oregon, and today I'm going to be giving you an introduction on CSS, cascading style sheets. Now, this introduction assumes that you've done some work with HTML. HTML is how we define the structure of web pages and websites. CSS is how we define the style of websites and web pages. So with CSS, we can do things like add color, or change fonts, or change the position and layout of different elements on a page.
I have an example HTML file up here for us to use, and we can see the render of that HTML file in a browser window right next to it. So we have a basic HTML file with a doc type in place, our HTML head and body tags. We also have a title tag up in the head of our document, and we have some content related tags, an H1 and a P, for a heading level 1 and paragraph in our body. Now we're going to be using CSS to change the style of the content that we have in our web page. And we're going to start by changing the color of our H1 tag. Now in order for us to do this, we need a place in our HTML document for CSS to live. And there's a couple different ways that we can do this. We can do what's called an embedded style, where we have CSS right in place in our HTML document. Or we can do something called external style sheets, where we actually have a completely separate CSS file that's completely different from our HTML file, and then we get our CSS file and our HTML file to talk to each other. We're going to do the embedded style sheets so that we can see all of our CSS right here on this page. Now in order for us to do this, we're going to use what's called a style tag up in the head of our document, and the style tag is going to create a place for CSS to live. Our style tag is a standard tag, so we're going to have an opening and a closing tag there. And we're going to be writing our CSS rules in between these style tags. Now it's very important in order for us to only write CSS in between these style tags. We're not going to be writing any HTML whatsoever in between these style tags. Now when you're writing CSS, you start off with the thing on the page that you want to affect. This is called your selector. So in this case, our selector is going to be one of the tags on our page. We're going to use the H1 tag to be our selector. So in this case, we're saying we're going to affect our H1 tag. Now immediately after our selector, we're going to have an opening curly bracket. You get these opening curly brackets by holding down your Shift key and then pressing the square bracket that's not too far away from the right Shift key on your keyboard. Now, Sublime filled out the closing curly bracket for me as well. I don't need that quite yet, so I'm going to delete that for just a moment. Now I'm going to drop down to my next line, and I'm going to now enter what's called a CSS property. This is the thing, the aspect of our selector that we're ultimately changing. Now we wanted to add color to our H1 tag, so in this case we're going to use a CSS property called color, which defines the color of the text or the color of the font. So my CSS property is going to be color. Immediately after the property, we're going to put a colon. And you notice that Sublime Text has already finished the rest of that for me. It put a semicolon in place. We are ultimately going to need that, but I'm going to get rid of that for just a moment. So our property is color, then we have a colon, and now we're going to add the value for this property. And values and properties go hand in hand. You're going to have different properties relating to different CSS values and vice versa. So in this case, we're going to use a named color for the property of color. Our value for this property is going to be green. We're saying we want to change the color of the H1 to green. We can actually define color in a few other different ways, not just using named colors. For example, we can use a hexadecimal format to define color that gives us a much larger range of color to pick from, but we're going to go over that a bit later. Immediately after our value, we're going to put a semicolon. That's pretty vital to make sure you have in place. If for some reason a CSS rule that you've written is not working, double check and make sure you have that semicolon in place. Now if we're done, if we're not going to write any other rules for this particular selector, we're going to close this entire thing off by putting a closing curly bracket in place. So again, if we take a look at this, we have our selector is H1. That's the thing on the page that we want to affect. Immediately after that, we have a opening curly bracket. Then we have our property. This is the aspect of the selector that we're changing. And in this case, we're using the CSS property color, which stands for the color of the text or the color of the font. Immediately after your property, you have a colon. And then immediately after that colon, you have a value. In this case, we used a named color, such as green, to be the value for this CSS property of color. Immediately after our value, we're going to have a semicolon, and this is what tells it that you're done writing this particular rule for this selector. Once we're all done, we're going to be putting in this closing curly bracket. That's what closes off our rule and makes it fire off. If we now save this document, and then we go and we refresh our browser, we now have green text up where the H1 is. So it read it from our style tags here and affected our H1 down here.